Hi, this is Tom Needham, and you're listening to The Sounds of Film. And joining us on the phone now is a great director, Matt Tyrnauer. You probably know Matt for his films Valentino, The Last Emperor, and Studio 54, as well as for his writing for Vanity Fair. His latest film is Where's My Roy Cohn? The film is a fascinating documentary that takes a good look at the controversial lawyer, Roy Cohn. Matt, thanks again for joining us on The Sounds of Film.
Thank you.
Oh, Matt, I love this movie. It's so interesting. Why did you want to make a movie about Roy Cohn?
Well, Roy Cohn created a president from beyond the grave, which I think is a unique, very dubious achievement in the history of the world, really. I was given the idea when I was making the Studio 54 film, because Roy Cohn's a major character in that story. He was the lawyer for Studio 54 and its owners, Ian Schrager and Steve Rubell. And that movie was being edited through the election year of 2016. So I was really marinating in archival footage of the period, and Cohn was in a lot of it. I kept thinking to myself, this is a great character for a documentary. There's never been one done. But I also knew enough to know that Cohn and Donald Trump were connected. And of course, the specter of a Trump presidency was hanging over everyone in that year. But I, like everyone else I know, thought that Hillary Clinton would win, and we would never have to think about Trump again, and maybe even not have to think so much about Roy Cohn, because he would be consigned to an earlier part of American history. But of course, when Trump won the Electoral College, everything changed. And I set out to make the movie really in November of 2016, because I really thought it was an important story to tell. In summation, if you want to understand Donald Trump, you've got to look at Roy Cohn.
It really is an amazing journey that he goes on, and where this film ends up is quite remarkable. People often refer to Roy Cohn as a fixer. What exactly is a fixer?
It's interesting to consider that question in light of the last week or so of our news cycles and history, because we're talking about Rudy Giuliani again a lot, and he's referred to as Donald Trump's personal attorney. But wiser people who are analyzing all of these events on TV usually pause and say, wait a minute, Rudy Giuliani is not Trump's attorney, really. He's not really practicing law. He's acting as a fixer. And I agree with that. A fixer is someone who works the favor bank for you, more or less. The favor bank, in this context of Roy Cohn, it refers to mid-century America, when business and politics and society were smaller, more exclusive, whiter, more waspy, and people did favors for each other, and that's what really made the world turn. And Cohn was the CEO of the favor bank, and he was a great fixer of his period. So as a lawyer, people would come to him, and he would fix problems, and not always using the law. He would call in political favors or favors from politicians, or the power structure of New York, which is where it was based, but really the whole United States at the time. And he also was the lawyer for mafia dons. So he was in a unique position on the bridge, really, or at the middle of the bridge that connected the legitimate world and the illegitimate world. And frequently when you needed something fixed, in the era when the mafia was really powerful in this country, the Italian mafia, sometimes you needed a favor done in the underworld, and Cohn could do that for you too. So he could practice law, but he really was much more than that. He was, as I've just defined, the ultimate fixer.
It's so amazing. You know, one of the most interesting aspects about this movie and about Roy Cohn in general is that he seemed to completely lack any ethics. that most people would consider to be normal. What was different about him when it came to ethics?
Well, he had none. Unscrupulous is a term I think that applies. He was, and I think would have admitted he was not really constrained by ethics. Lawyers are axiomatically bound to a code of ethics because they are members of the bar, and a code of ethics goes along with that. And Cohn flouted that consistently. He was a fluid person in that he was a registered Democrat who really worked for Republicans and the conservative side of politics. And he was a lawyer who was a criminal, and he was a member of the bar who was really tantamount to being a mafia consigliere. And he went beyond just defending mafia dons. He consorted with them. So unlike Tom Hagen in The Godfather, who's the consigliere played by Robert Duvall, he's a lawyer. He's sort of like the, adopted brother, nephew, and in the Corleone family, and he's a member of the bar, he's an attorney, but he's in the family. Cohn was not in the family of the five families of New York at that time, but he was operating with them and consorting with them, and he really found his power in that way. And the world of the mafia was very connected to the world of politics. No one talked about it, but certainly when the Italian mafia was powerful, American politicians sometimes owed a lot to them. And we don't want to go down the rabbit hole of the JFK conspiracy, but Sam Giancana and JFK were connected by a mistress they had in common, Judith Exner, but also the mafia was getting involved with the CIA at the time, etc. This was this world of dark, shadowy conspiracy and fixing and unethical behavior that Cohn thrived in. And I think we're back in a way to a period like that because his protege is now president of the United States.
Well, it's funny, though, because I think to some extent people over the last 20 or 30 years have grown to like that kind of thing. I'm a big fan of Goodfellas. You mentioned The Godfather. I've watched years and years of reality TV like Survivor. And in these shows, it's only a show, but you learn that in order to win, you have to lie, cheat, and steal. And sometimes there's people like supervillains who are really good at it, and you root for them. And in Goodfellas, you root for the guys to some extent, even though they're terrible, and they're terrible. And you make the point in this movie that people knew that he wasn't always up to good, and yet so many people embraced him, and the media embraced him. And he really did have this ability to have people want to be around him. It was pretty incredible.
Yeah, there's a lot in what you just said that is really interesting to unpack. First of all, the glamour of evil.
Yeah.
It's kind of baked into our society. I'll pick one example. When in the Prohibition era, which allowed organized crime to explode in this country because trafficking in illegal spirits was suddenly a big business, and the mafia had a field day then. A lot of early sound movies were gangster movies because they were depicting what was happening in the 20s and 30s. Right. Scarface is a really famous example of them. And frequently the gangsters in these films were the leading men, and they were very charismatic. And they sometimes were cold-blooded killers who killed with a smile on their face. And they became sort of heroic. They were outlaw heroes, and there's something about that that's kind of stuck to the narratives of American popular culture. Cohn fits into that category, really. He's sort of a happy scoundrel. He wears it on his sleeve.
Right.
He metaphorically kills with a smile on his face. He promotes himself as a rascally scoundrel and a super genius villain. We're kind of in the territory of James Bond, or even, I don't think any of this is really funny, but Dr. Evil,
right,
which is obviously a parody of James Bond villains. People sometimes love a scoundrel, and he knew that, and he played into it, and I think his pupil, Trump, knows that as well. So, he played a scary boss on TV, and he knows how to do that, and I think he's kind of has obviously crossed over, and this is no joke anymore. This is not reality TV, but all of these themes and tropes are baked into our society, and in this explosive media wired age we live in, I think we're losing track of what is reality and what is fiction, and it's sort of blending together, and Trump has been in the right place at the right time to take advantage of that. But again, the 1.0 of this is Roy Cohn. He knew how to manipulate the media, and he knew how to manipulate what I call the media society political complex, or nexus plexus, and he was sort of the mayor of this world in New York, which was a very powerful city, probably more powerful than it is now in mid-century. And a part of the key to his success was these press relationships, and he cast himself in this role. The press ate it up, and he kept it going for the better part of 40 years. And the press, and I think this applies to his pupil Trump as well, the press is complicit in this because they love good copy.
Right.
They love a scoundrel. He's sort of like a hero scoundrel because he's winning as an attorney and a powerful celebrated figure. And who's this remind you of? And where did Trump get it from? If you see the film, you'll know he got it from only one place, and that's Roy Cohn. So Cohn really was a defining figure in a lot of ways, who was a forgotten force in American society. He becomes hyper-relevant in an era of a Trump presidency because, again, he was the Machiavellian tutor of Donald Trump.
It's so remarkable. I mean, and it's amazing how far back his work goes. You spend a good deal in this movie going back and looking at his early work with Joseph McCarthy. What's significant about this period that we should all remember?
Yes, well, this is really a very salient point, and I forgot to say at the top that one of the really chilling and remarkable things that we all need to know, and if we don't know, figure out, or if we did know and forgot, remember, is that Roy Cohn is the link between Joseph McCarthy and Donald Trump. Roy Cohn was the chief counsel for Senator Joseph McCarthy's communist witch hunting subcommittee. He was the Svengali of McCarthy. And he later on, when Trump is just a rising real estate aspirant in the 70s in New York, becomes the Svengali of Trump. So Joseph McCarthy and Donald Trump have the same advisor and enabler, and that's Roy Cohn. The McCarthy period, which was the 50s basically, called the McCarthy era, was a time of charge and countercharge and great suspicion and witch hunting in this country. It was a very dark period, really, that coincided with a remarkable period in our history, which was the era of post-war prosperity and the rise of the middle class. So there's a lot of amazing things happen in that time, but the dark flip side of it is what we think of, and justifiably so, call the McCarthy era. And Cohn was one of the authors of that. Trump engages in this kind of political skullduggery, really, and demagoguery. McCarthyism is the shorthand for demagogic behavior and the perpetration of big lie propaganda tactics, which is a frankly hilarious term about perpetrating lies and misinformation that becomes common belief in the body politic and allows demagogic behavior to thrive. Trump, again, learned all these tricks from the wizard himself, Roy Cohn, and he is practicing them in a new media context, and he is succeeding. He's used Twitter, a relatively new media platform, which has taken the place of things like newspapers and radio to some extent. And he's, because he learned his lessons well from Cohn, he's able to succeed. Roy Cohn, another thing we haven't really said in this interview is that Roy Cohn was brilliant. He was kind of a prodigy, maybe an IQ genius, who used his intelligence consistently for evil. I don't think Trump's any genius, but I do think he's sort of an idiot savant who learned a lesson very well from Cohn, which was how to be a demagogue. And he was in the right place at the right time and is a symptom of a lot of really deep structural problems that have taken hold in our republic right now.
I know you're not any fan of Trump, obviously, but isn't it ironic, though, sort of, that Cohn was involved with these witch hunts and he had a relationship with Trump, and now you have Trump saying that there's a witch hunt for him and that there's allegations of Russian collusion, and then even recently Clinton calling out Tulsi Gabbard and Jill Stein saying that they're colluding with Russians. I mean, it's really sad that it's really come to this point now where this whole Russia thing is happening again to some extent.
Well, like I said, the McCarthy period was an era of suspicion and charge and countercharge and demagoguery, which is just the type of toxic climate that Trump can thrive in, and a Roy Cohn could thrive in, or McCarthy could thrive in. So when you infect the body politic with this kind of behavior, you get this, and it self-perpetuates until one hopes, flames out, or someone comes and gives the kind of big blow to the public psyche that shakes people out of it. In the McCarthy period, few people were heroic and rose up and did that. Edward R. Murrow gave a few broadcasts on his TV show, and he really said things that needed to be said. And then Joseph Welch, who was the counsel for the Army in the Army McCarthy hearings, which was a huge televised spectacle with Joseph McCarthy and Roy Cohn right at the center of it in this witch hunt period. Joseph Welch had the immortal attack at McCarthy, aimed toward McCarthy, which was on live television, where he says, "At long last, have you no sense of decency?" And this caught the national consciousness and helped bring McCarthy down, and he was censured by the Senate, etc. And that sort of was the beginning of the end of the McCarthy period. When witch hunters accuse other people of witch hunting them, this is big lie, propaganda, Hitlerian tactics. And that's what Trump's simply doing. This was another one of the Roy Cohn rules of operation, which is accuse your accusers of what you're guilty of. And Trump does this on a daily basis, multiple times a day. So he'll call Adam Schiff Shifty Schiff, And it's kind of remarkable to me. The press is, Shift's very high profile. What's shifty about Shift? What's shifty about Schiff, rather? Probably nothing. Definitely nothing, I would say. We know. And yet here we are talking about it, and Trump's winning already because he's given him this moniker and this type of dirty pool, petty, demagogic behavior almost always works to some extent. The media, again, is, I think, culpable to a certain extent. Fox News is basically state television at this point. But even, in my opinion, the very noble MSNBC, which has extraordinary journalists and does incredible reporting and public affairs programming in the public service. By the third segment on some of these really intelligent shows, you're suddenly talking about Shifty Shift or Greenland being on the block and Trump trying to buy Greenland. And when that happens, Trump wins because he's just sucking all the oxygen. And he learned this from Cohn. Basically another adage of Cohn and McCarthy is no such thing as bad publicity. And Donald Trump certainly understands that.
Well, one of my favorite parts in the movie has to do with TV, and that is whenever you would cut to some of the conversation between Cohn and Gore Vidal. And your movie made me want to go back and watch those exchanges. Can you tell our audience a little bit about what was interesting about Gore Vidal and Roy Cohn having it out on television?
Well, so this is an exchange that happens in the early 70s on a TV show in New York where, for some reason, Vidal and Cohn were on together.
That was incredible.
And, sorry?
That was incredible. That was like an amazing exchange, I thought.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. It makes you wistful for the old days of TV when public intellectuals such as Gore Vidal had time on television. But that aside, the reason I put it in the film, I used 3 clips from this particular show, which was the Bill Boggs show. If you're a New York resident, you know about this show, which was a morning show in New York for years. And Vidal just goes after Cohn and really gets at him in a way that no one else ever did. And it's around sexuality. Roy Cohn was a gay man and a closeted gay guy, and he was a hypocrite around his sexuality because in the 50s, McCarthy and Cohn not only hunted so-called communists in the government, and most of the people they hunted and wrecked the careers of actually weren't communists, but that was part of their tactic because it was pure demagoguery. But another villain that they hunted were gay people, of course, who weren't villains at all, but they wanted to make them into villains, and it was called the Lavender Scare. So you had Cohn, who was a gay guy in the closet, ruining the lives of other gay people who were in the government and in the armed forces. And McCarthy, who may or may not have been gay himself, there's always been speculation about that. And Cohn colluded to do this for their own personal gain. So this is not beyond unethical and unscrupulous. It's evil. Cohn never apologized for it, and he kind of bore this hypocrisy and perpetuated it for the rest of his life. So what happens on this show is that Vidal goes for the jugular, and he says, paraphrasing, well, let's be affirmative, Mr. Cohn. The most positive thing I've ever heard about Senator Joseph McCarthy was told me by Senator Flanders of Vermont, and that is that McCarthy was a full-time homosexual. Is this true? You can see Cohn sort of blanch and fidget a little, and he says, well, I know that's your favorite subject of conversation. And Vidal then jabs right back, and he says, it's aroused by the obvious. So he's basically outing Cohn on television. But Vidal was gay himself and was not so much in the closet. He was writing novels with openly gay plots and characters, and was a real spokesman for civil liberties and what then was called gay lib, or gay rights. And he's really sticking it to Cohn, and you couldn't really directly out someone, and you still really can't in the mainstream media. But if anyone ever deserved to be needled for this because of his hypocrisy, it was Cohn. So I put that in the movie because, first of all, it's an exchange that I feel should be legendary. Vidal does it so elegantly and so brilliantly. It's always a pleasure to see Gore Vidal, so erudite and such an amazing presence on television. And that he had this moment of triumph over Cohn in the early 70s that probably went over most people's heads was still very, I thought, powerful to see all these years later.
Matt, not the subject of the movie, but while we're talking about Gore, I understand that you edited a couple of his later nonfiction books. Is that correct?
Yes, I did. Specifically essays. So I was editor-at-large of Vanity Fair, and Vidal, I think, is one of the great masters of English literature and a real hero. He was not really getting his essays published in the 90s. A few were getting into the Nation, and he was losing a lot of his access to platforms. So I got him into Vanity Fair, which is one of the things I'm most proud of. I ended up editing, probably a dozen essays of his, which were collected in really, really great books. I think one's called The United States of Amnesia.
Yeah.
And they were the last of these essay collections. One's called Perpetual War for Perpetual Peace, and I was the editor of those. I'm a great admirer of his, and he was a mentor of mine. So I thought, I didn't know about this clip of Vidal and Cohn going at each other on TV, but when I found it, I really wanted to put it in the film, and I found, as I said, 3 places to put Vidal in. And Vidal was really, for those of your listeners who don't know about his career, he was a public intellectual, novelist, and essayist who really had such an amazing way of presenting things on television, but also was a very deep thinker. So he wasn't just a pretty face and a talking head. He was a real essayist and political theorist and literary critic. We don't really have people like that on TV anymore. So I'm wistful for those days, which is why I wanted to give him a place in this film.
Well, I appreciate that you did, and I appreciate that you published those essays because, just as a side note, I really came to appreciate his work really during that period that you described, and I was a big fan of those books and those essays, and I really wish that he had stuck around a little bit longer. There's so much I'd love to ask him. Just one thing, if you don't even mind me asking you, I think he started to lose some followers at a certain point when he started to question some things about the Oklahoma bombing and 9/11, and I was curious, just from your perspective, like what exactly, I've heard mixed things about, like what did he suspect? It seemed like he had questions about the official story related to those stories, and I think there's some stuff in those books about that.
Yeah, it's complicated, but it's an interesting phase of his career. I was right there for it. He felt that Timothy McVeigh was a harbinger of something rising in the American culture, which was, I think, was borne out. Actually, he thought that McVeigh was an early warning sign of a faction of deeply disaffected citizens who were becoming radicalized. began to write to him out of the blue, really, after the bombing, because he was reading Vidal's essays in prison, and Vidal was intrigued because these letters, which I saw, were really quite intelligent. McVeigh wasn't a stupid person, actually. I don't agree at all with his politics outlook, actions, anything about him, but he was actually capable of deep thought, and which was interesting and kind of diabolical to see. So he wrote Vidal these very thoughtful letters, responding to Vidal's essays about the destruction or the weakening of the Bill of Rights. And Gore thought this was an interesting point, and they began to have a dialogue. And I think as Vidal began to understand what McVeigh's philosophy was, he wrote this essay, which was published in Vanity Fair and won Best Essay of the Year from Harvard University, actually. It was called The Meaning of Timothy McVeigh. It wasn't a pro-Timothy McVeigh essay, really. It's been misconstrued as that because people like to vilify Gore Vidal. It was really sort of a warning about disaffected factions in mostly rural areas, and Vidal was pointing out that a lot of these members of society were feeling alienated and were turning to drugs such as crystal meth, etc., and really were being forced into dead ends by the way that American society was being restructured, and he felt that McVeigh was a member of that faction, and that we should probably pay attention to this. And I think that's been borne out. Some factions of Trump voters, I think, are in this group, and it's something that we talk about now more regularly. But at the time, this was not something that was in the mainstream of politics. Things like books like What's the Matter with Kansas, and I think it's called Bowling Alone.
Yeah.
These are getting at these themes that have since become more obvious in society. And I think Gore, as usual, was ahead of his time in identifying this. Absolutely.
He was very critical of the government, but Roy Cohn, on the other hand, was like this master of like wrapping the flag around himself, kind of like President Trump does. Can you explain a little bit about how Trump learned that from him, and what we really have to take away from their relationship in general?
Well, yeah, so demagogues tend to appeal to patriotism. Demagogues tend to vilify the other. Again, back to Hitler. In that period, it was primarily Jews in Europe, Jews in general, gay people, gypsies. Trump started his campaign by vilifying Mexicans on the day that he announced his candidacy. We all remember those ugly sentences that he spoke. And he at times has vilified Arab people and Muslims, and he just picks someone and he makes them into an other. And if you are one of those others, or if you are a sympathizer to their cause or their being, you become defined as unpatriotic. And then the demagogue wraps themselves in the flag, and this is a good way to kind of hypnotize the body politic. And it happened in the McCarthy period, and Trump is doing his level best to imitate McCarthy who, though he was never an elected politician, would appeal to patriotism because he was a very public figure, and he courted the media, was on TV all the time for his various exploits from the McCarthy period on down to his period being a mob attorney. But he also was assailed by the U.S. Attorney of the Southern District of Manhattan and indicted 3 times. And he got off of all of those indictments without being convicted. And memorably, the day that he was acquitted of one of these conspiracy and bribery charges, he gave a press conference and said, God bless America. And this is just the last refuge of the demagogic scoundrel. And it's 101 from the Hitler's Goebbels modern demagogue playbook. And Cohn was not immune to it, and Trump's not immune to it either. He's done virtually the same thing in the White House driveway a few weeks ago. He wrapped himself in the flag and said that he was a super patriot and God bless America and all that. And it works to a certain extent. About 39-40% of the electorate seems to go for that.
Well, Matt, do you have time for one more question?
Sure.
Okay. This is a powerful documentary, but it's also just a great dramatic story, and it's a tragic story. As much as Roy Cohn, had great power and wealth and influence, the end of his life was rather sad. Can you just tell us a little bit about what happened to Roy in the final days that maybe people don't know about?
Yes, well, he had a extraordinary run of success, becoming increasingly demonic, and he started out pretty demonic too. It's covered in the movie. We haven't mentioned it here, but even before he was chief counsel to McCarthy, he was junior prosecutor on the Julius Ethel Rosenberg spy case, and he managed to get Ethel Rosenberg sentenced to the electric chair.
Wow.
And then basically he never really showed any signs of empathy and increasing signs of greed and jealousy, greed and skullduggery, I guess you'd say. He was a big tax cheat, flouting the law left and right, representing mafia dons, but consistently getting away with it all. And then it did catch up with him eventually. He had about a 40-year run of what Rachel Maddow now calls criming, which I think is funny in relation to Trump. She says that he's continues on his criming, or that he's a one-man crime wave. Cohn was certainly that. Eventually, he was disbarred because the disciplinary committee of the New York bar got on to him, and Martin London, who was a very sharp white shoe attorney, was appointed head of this disciplinary committee, and he caught Cohn finally. And he was kicked off the bar, but he was very sick at that time because he contracted the HIV/AIDS virus in the early 80s, and he died a few weeks after he was disbarred. So there was a kind of sudden cascade running out of road after decades of absolutely unaltered, unassailed criminal behavior. If it was assailed, as Robert Morgenthau tried to do, it was something that he was always able to wiggle out of. And he kept, thanks to a complicit press in large part, a high public profile, and considering all the crimes that he committed, a relatively good reputation in society, New York society. That nexus of politics and money and society let him get away with it. The movie is meant to remind people of who this man was and what his surprising current influence is.
Well, Matt, you did a fantastic job with this film. This is a must-see movie. We've been talking to Matt Tyrnauer about his movie, Where's My Roy Cohn? It's one of the best documentaries out there right now. I highly recommend everyone go see it. And Matt, I hope you get all the credit that you deserve for making this film. And somewhere down the line, I'd love to have you back on and just talk about your work with Gore Vidal. You people should check out those clips that we were talking about. Besides seeing the movie, you should check out those clips because that's an amazing exchange too. But once again, the film is Where's My Roy Cohn? And Matt, thanks again for coming on the Sounds of Film.
Always a pleasure. Thank you.
Okay, take it easy. Good night.
Good night.